Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome everybody again to our Willis Long and Friends, and our first Willis Long and Friends since the launch of our Nurture Care Connection website and our commitment to a growing social movement to advance early relational health for strong, positive, and nurturing relationships and to build healthier, resilient, and more connected communities. As before, I'm delighted to have my co-host Dana Long. You want to say hello, Dana?
Hello, everyone. Such a pleasure to be here with you today, as always.
So, Dana, do you want to set the stage and then I'll introduce Bruce?
I would love to. So, as many of you know, Willis Long and Friends is a lively series that's hosted by David and I. And our goal is to explore meaningful, intentional, thought-provoking efforts to really advance early relational health. And this is in terms of both families and children and communities. We want to change the way that we are actually talking about relationships and the space between all of us. So this series affords us an opportunity for fun and meaningful conversation. And it is, as David said, the first part of our series since we've joined and formed the Nature Connection. And so thank you to all of you who are part of Nurture Connection, and we hope to continue expanding. So our experts who join us on Willis Long and Friends are from across the nation. They share with us their personal stories and narratives. They share their innovative pilots and programs, groundbreaking research, and advocacy efforts.
Dana's beautiful, and I think your dogs are celebrating with us, right? They're cheering along, and my little puppy is similarly crying in the other room and wants to be a part of the story. So it's all good. So I love these sessions. I love having our friends come together, our colleagues, our national thought leaders, so many of whom have inspired me and are inspiring you about advancing RH across this growing Nurture Connection network. And today's really delighted because of that same tradition. I want to introduce you to my friend Bruce Perry. You know, Bruce, you and I go way back. You and I met in Portland when about 2000 or maybe 1999, I invited you to present at Legacy Manual Children's. And it was at that time the beginning of across early childhood work. I was green beyond the ears, learning about systems work, but the relationship between health, child welfare, trauma, recovery, mental health promotion, that whole early childhood space. And I remember, you know, after you always get the crowd all excited, which is always fun. But we went out to lunch and there were 5 or 6 of us sitting at lunch. And I remember you and I having lofty conversations about, oh my gosh, we got to change the culture because our children are not doing well. And unfortunately, they're having even more difficulty, but we've learned a lot. And you've continued an incredibly strong voice along your journey with consultation work. And I did some consultation work with you around some casework with your neurosequential network. And then you and I have been on a few panels together. I remember the one memorable one was at the first year anniversary of the Newtown shooting. Remember? That was just so compellingly powerful. And then we sat across some other kind of thought partnership tables, and I've always followed your work. You know, I'm honored that that we have you today to talk about your wisdom and your journey. But most of all, you wrote that amazing book with Oprah. And as I shared with you, that has been to listen to your voices together and musing about trauma, resiliency, recovery, and future connection for building next generation. It just sang to me, and we've shared it with a lot of people because it's so important. So Bruce, you're a child psychiatrist, neuroscientist, the principal of the Neurosequential Networks, senior fellow at Child Trauma Academy, adjunct professor of psychiatry at Northwestern. You know, you've written over 500 journal articles, books, and chapters, Bruce. I mean, my God. And
I'm just really damn old. I mean,
hell, I am too. And so, but a recipient of numerous professional awards. Tell you how delighted I am for us just to have this conversation together. And so, Dana, do you want to sort of frame maybe the first way we begin to talk together?
I would love to. We're so honored for you, Bruce, to share what you've learned over the course of your career about early relational health. And I would love to start with, tell us about the work with Oprah. How did that start? How did you meet her? And what did you hope to accomplish when you started that work?
Well, I've actually known Oprah a lot longer than I've known David. And that's a long time. So Oprah and I, well over 30 years, we've known each other and had a number of different kinds of relational interactions, both professional and personal. And over the years, I've had the opportunity to talk with her and work with her on a couple of different big projects. And she's always been a tremendous advocate of understanding human behavior. I mean, that's the whole basis of her show. She's an incredibly good interviewer. She's very, very intuitive. She's a really good listener, even though sometimes it doesn't seem like it. But it's so I've known her forever, and so she was after she stopped her show, she was a 60 Minutes special correspondent. Mm-hmm. And was doing a story in Milwaukee because she had read something in the Milwaukee paper about a program that was working with women who'd been involved in domestic violence and their children. And because that's kind of one of her hometowns, she wanted to do the story there. So she goes there and she's interviewing people. And one of the clinicians says, "Oh, we use a model by this guy named Bruce Perry." She goes, "Oh, I know him." So she called me up and said, "Hey, you want to be in this 60 Minutes show?" And I'm like, "What do I have to do?" And she said, "Well, we have to talk for a while." I'm like, "Okay." So we did our little 60 Minutes interview, and afterwards, after it aired, this is so interesting, and this is sort of part of what you all should think about, is that the power of that kind of a medium. I think I was on that for like 90 seconds, maybe total. But what happened was her publisher called Oprah and said, "Listen, would you think Bruce would be willing to write a book about this stuff?" And so Oprah was talking to me, and I said, "Well, Oprah, I've already written a book about this, and nobody's reading it." I said, the people that need to learn about these things are people who aren't going to go pick up sort of a semi-academic book and read it. So you should write the book. And she's like, "I don't want to write a book." And we went back and forth. And finally they said, "Well, let's write the book together." Because I said, "We've been talking about this stuff for years." And so we just recorded a bunch of conversations, which we turned it into a transcript, and then I wrote the book from there. But it was, it's the point of the book, the intention of the book was for people who aren't familiar with these areas to get some introduction to it, to really stimulate some thought. As you well know, you guys, if you've read it or listened to it, there are a lot of things that we sort of bring up, but then leave, right? We bring up really almost tantalizing concepts that people want to dive in a little bit, but then we don't really dive in that much. And in part, it's because the intention is to stimulate conversation. And I think it's done pretty well with regards to that. And so that's kind of the whole thing about Oprah. And one of the things that relevant to what your focus on early relational health, I think one of the pieces of the conversation that Oprah comes back to all the time, and every time we do sort of post, we did a little bit of promotion for the book, was the research that we'd done on the power of the first 2 months of life. And that's from a big study, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but where we had data on thousands and thousands of individuals, where we were able to get information about the quality of their relational health and the presence or absence of adversity early in life, and really found that the major and most powerful factor in predicting outcomes later in life that had to do with impulsivity, attention, regulation, depression, and everything else was the quality of early relational health. and that the first 2 months of life actually were so powerful as a predictor that if you had relational poverty and adversity in the first 2 months of life,
you're in trouble.
but then ended up in a pretty decent setting. Maybe were adopted or went into the foster care system for whatever worth that is. But your outcomes were worse than if you had high quality, had good connection in the first 2 months of life, and minimal adversity, and then went into basically hell for the next 15 years. So that protective impact of that relational connection early in life was playing this major role in organizing key systems involved in resilience, managing stress, and so forth. And we think we have some ideas about how that happens, but that observation, that finding, was very, very striking to Oprah, and I think to a lot of people when they hear about it.
It jumped out, and I shared that with our research team, and we have an amazing research team building at Columbia that are looking intentionally at the mechanistic issues related relationally of that emotional connection exchange experience in those first few months. Yeah. And thinking deeply about what is it telling us, what is it showing us, and what are the mechanisms underneath of that. Yeah. So when you're ready, we ought to share that with them too, because there's something. Sure. Our team, our research network is building around this dyadic research, development, and learning. And those early elements are really important. Shockingly important.
Well, all of that is very much related to the research that I started, 35 years ago in developmental neuroscience, really as a sort of a grandchild or an academic offspring of Seymour Levine, who was studying early relational stressors and the development of the stress response systems in the central nervous system. And so part of what I was studying in when I was getting my doctorate and then afterwards was the role of these core regulatory networks like serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine as morphogens. Right. They play major developmental roles in the organization of upstream systems in the central nervous system. And their organization is highly dependent upon the first few weeks of relational interactions from the primary caregiver, and rat mom or dog mom or primate mom, and sometimes others as well. But really, those systems really, in order for them to develop normally, require certain forms of somatosensory stimulation, which are really the bread and butter of high quality relational connection, right? The somatosensory bath that's part of this attentive, attuned caregiving interaction, that's providing the organizing stimulus to these systems, which then are able to play this really important role in development.
The implications of all that are shockingly important, especially now with our quote unquote mental health epidemics of youth and young children. And then the attentional issues and the autism spectrum issues, and right down the list. Yeah. So there's a lot to really, you and I had that conversation 25 years ago about the importance of relational experience. And we've learned a lot more, but how do we flesh it out for policy change, right? I mean, we're still in that kind of tension, and Dana being primary care, she lives it. Dana, what are your reactions to those?
I want to know more. I want to know more about your journey to wanting to understand the mechanisms of the power of connection and what is happening, as you said, within that bath that happens during the first 2 months of life. Can you talk more about how you got interested in studying that time, and how your interest continued to grow, and what continues to attract you to the importance of the early years?
Right. Well, and again, I mean, I've been sort of blessed by a lot of serendipitous experiences in my life. And one of those was when I went off to college. I went to college basically to run track. And I went to Stanford. I had no idea that it was, I mean, I kind of knew it was a good academic school, but I didn't know it was like, that's kind of what they were supposed to be doing. I thought they were supposed to be winning the Rose Bowl, and they had the Olympic track coach was the track coach there, so he recruited me to go to Stanford, and so I was randomly assigned to a freshman seminar with Seymour Levine. Seymour Levine, for those of you who don't know, is basically the academic godfather of Michael Meany, Megan Gunnar, anybody who's anything in stress and stress developmental neurobiology related to stress, either was a student or postdoc with with Levine or with one of Levine's primary students. And so I just got assigned to his freshman seminar. And the freshman seminar program at Stanford, you would meet with this person and a group of maybe 12 other freshmen every week for a year. And so I had no idea what a gift that was. And over that year, I learned a lot about the early developmental experiences that led to imprinting. Actually, I remember Nico Tinbergen got the Nobel laureate, and it kind of pissed off Levine because he probably should have been a co-awardee at that point. But the point was that these little trigger experiences, if you showed a duckling at the right time, a dog, literally for like seconds, the duck would think the dog was its parent and follow it around. And so all of these interesting phenomenon around early development were fascinating to me. And like Seymour Levine's work, for example, on vocalization in primates when they were separated from their parent, and all kinds of work with rats and handling stress in the first day, second day, third day, fifth day, eighth day, completely different outcomes depending upon which day there was the stressor. And so this whole field of understanding that both the presence and the pattern of stress made a huge difference in outcomes. And so I literally was studying that in tissue culture, animal models from that point forward as an undergraduate. And then even as a medical student, I had a lab. And as a resident, I was given a lab. I had a lab at Yale. So I did basic developmental neuroscience around these core regulatory networks early on. And then, now the interesting thing is, I'm coming into this with this very powerful, pretty solid understanding of the importance of early development, right? And how that shapes outcomes in adult life. And then I get into psychiatry. Nobody knows shit about this. I mean, I was like shocked. And I would bring up stuff like, well, did anybody take a developmental history? They're like, oh yeah, rolled over at the right age and walked at the right age and, had finger food. And like, but no. I mean, like, what was the house like? Was there chaos? Was there predictability? And people didn't get it. Now, the interesting thing is all of the research that we know now about what creates resilience is about the pattern of stress activation. That research was done when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. That's 40 years ago. And so, and maybe it's 50 years ago now. Jesus, I'm really old.
I tend to forget, Bruce. I don't like to think about it.
But what I knew was that a rat, and if you stressed it in a predictable way, it would develop certain stress response capabilities that made it what we now call resilient. But if you gave it the same amount of stress, but there was no predictability to it, it would get dysregulated, overwhelmed, sick, get ulcers. And really very, very similar to the research that was done around learned helplessness, right? That the very same stimulus to these core regulatory networks, if it's predictable, consistent, moderate, leads one direction. If it's unpredictable, uncontrollable, prolonged, leads in a different direction. The exact same findings can be created using external activators of these core regulatory networks. Meth, fenfluramine, anything that activates, serotonergic, dopaminergic, noradrenergic systems. So if you give cocaine in a consistent, predictable way, you end up with an animal that's basically resistant, tolerant to cocaine. You give the exact same amount of cocaine over a 24-hour period, but you give it at different times of the day and different doses, that animal gets a sensitized stress response system and will have a seizure in 2 weeks. And so this is the kind of thing we'd see in clinically, we would see people come into the ER in the 48 hours after payday, and they were having seizures. And it was because they'd go out and buy a bunch of cocaine and they just take a whole bunch of it. But if you were rich and you could afford your cocaine, you could take it moderately, predictably, and controllably, and you never ended up with the same seizures. But if you're poor and we're working paycheck to paycheck, you had all these bad outcomes from the cocaine. Same thing happened with heroin. And anyway, I could go on and on. But so I knew all of that before I started training in psychiatry. And so when I started to talk to my colleagues about this, I'm like, wow, you guys are not like, you don't get this. The only people in psychiatry that really got it, believe it or not, were people that were analytically trained, who were very developmental, and people who were doing psychologists who were doing developmental psychology work early, and then the people that were really just beginning to do attachment work. And they were usually sort of the stepchild of the department, right? They were kind of marginalized in the department. They were kind of off to the side. Oh yeah, we have this one person. I guess they've heard of, they've heard of Mary Dozier, I guess. So they're going to teach that. But you go over there, and you guys know what this is like in pediatric departments, right? The people that do that kind of stuff, they're kind of like, they get the offices in the basement and no windows. So I kept sort of trying to bring this understanding about development and the understanding about the brain into my clinical practice. And I finally just quit. Honestly, I just stopped. I quit trying to modify the existing DSM paradigm. And we just backed out of it. We started our own way of thinking about and systematically gathering developmental history about things that we thought were important, including relational health, connection to community and culture, things that are, the social determinants of health. And then we started, we went through a process that was really painful, where the assessment process that we developed that would capture all this stuff, it was just impractical to export. So we had to sort of simplify it to the point where it's just on the boundary of being what I would call research acceptable. But it's very helpful for the clinicians that are using it. And so it's spread like wildfire. So now we have, people using this approach and gathering this data in a systematic way in 37 countries. And we have an N over 110,000 individuals who have pretty well detailed developmental history, looking at the timing and the nature of their relational health and the timing and the nature of their adversities and their current functioning. And so we've been just beginning to mine that data. And some of the first stuff we published was the stuff I talked about in that book I wrote with Oprah, where we found that this early relational, the single most powerful predictor of outcomes in mental health domains that we looked at in later life were related to relational connection in the first 2 months of life. And that's not to say that adversity wasn't important, but the relational health stuff always outweighed the impact of adversity. And again, this is something that everybody else is, in other ways, they've seen the same thing, right? I mean, it's something that's why you guys are doing what you're doing. It's such a powerful and important part of.
Yeah, let me lean in a little bit there with two thoughts. One is, I know you also spent some time with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear how that has folded into your good thinking now. And secondly, the power of relational connections to heal. Because you leaned heavily within that framing, within the book with Oprah, and I know I've heard you speak many times, but on top of that narrative, not being on the couch, but narrative between people listening, because, the healing of culture is going to not be a clinical activity. It's going to be a new way of being connected, I believe. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah. So part of our kind of stepping back from the traditional medical model involved a recognition that as much as I wanted to be helping people in an hour a week, that was an insufficient dose of experience to lead to the kinds of changes that I knew would be required in the central nervous system. So again, going back to my basic neuroscience experiences, I mean, I knew that neural networks can change, but I also knew that the nature of the signals that cause change were very different than the nature of the signals that we were giving in traditional therapy. So the dosing and spacing was very different. And so a dose of meaningful activity to change a neural network could be very brief, but it had to be repeated and repeated and repeated. And so over time, we began to realize that, listen, and this is kind of embarrassing, but as we were stepping back from the traditional medical model, we were just inching in this different version of thinking about therapeutics and thinking about what we do. But at some point, after we'd been sort of, I don't know, we self-declared ourselves like we really know what we're doing, which is so funny because it's such an arrogant perspective. But I finally said, oh, I know, people are like, they want to know about what we do and they pat us on the back and that's all great. But I said, why don't we actually measure what we do? And that was a very sobering experience. So it turns out, as good as we were at that point in what we were doing, and we were pretty good, I think. We were trying to do everything the right way. And 50% of the people that came to see us never came back after the first couple of months. So 50% of the people were, quote, lost to follow-up. And of course, we never, that's the norm with public mental health clinics, right? And
or worse.
Or worse, exactly. And then the people that did stay, there was a huge range. Some people got better, some people didn't. And we looked and we're like, what the hell? It's the same clinicians, same approach, same assessment. Well, what's different? And we couldn't figure it out. And so I was just sitting around playing with the data at one point, and I just plugged in the variable zip code. And what I realized was the further away you lived from the clinic, the healthier, the better the outcomes. And then I realized that in order to come to the clinic every Wednesday at 4, mom or grandma or dad had to drive you in. You went to your appointment, and then you had to go eat dinner and you go drive back. And I realized that that's what's the variable. It's not us. It's time with a caregiver. And so we went back and said, all right, we're looking at the wrong thing. And it was right about that time that I had one of my visits to a second visit to New Zealand and spent time with some Maori healers. And it was literally like, I'd been told this before. I've been told this before by my colleagues that were Lakota. I've been told this before by the elders I was working with who were Navajo. But I finally was able to hear the power of relational connection and connection to community and culture as being a huge and important variable. And from that point forward, we're like, oh my God, I can't believe that we have been not looking at this. and it was embarrassing. It's like, oh my God, you just realize how your training puts blinders on you and you just don't see the whole story. And from that point forward, we just started to shift faster and more dramatically towards a model where we actually think our first question, our whole treatment planning process starts with the community. And so we go, all right, what's your culture? Who's in your community? How stable is it? Who are you connected in that community? What's your belief system? Are you part of a community of faith? And we come into extended family, who's involved in who you're connected with. And then we come to family and do you guys have enough food to eat? Do you have a place to stay? Because all of this stuff is parallel process. Yeah. Through these echoes of, the neighborhood and the federal policy around how your neighborhood is economically sustained or not. And And if you know the neurosociology of human beings, that we're contagious to the people around us, and so relational milieu is the major determinant of your stress response. So you can be in the midst of a frickin' earthquake in Turkey, but if your parents are feeding you, and if they're regulated, and if you go to bed at the same time, your perception of that stressful experience will be buffered. And so, and the opposite can take place. If you have a parent who's so over anxious and always sort of like making you feel anxious, you can be living in the most amazing, stable environment and develop as an anxious child. And so our first treatment planning thing is to think about the therapy, what we call the therapeutic web. What's the relational mix and the relational milieu in your life. And what we found is the best predictor of how somebody's going to do when we work with them clinically is their current relational health. So you can have the best evidence-based package of treatments, but if you aren't connected to an after-school program, you're not part of a sports team, you're not in drama, dance, you go home after school, there's nobody there, and you watch TV, you're isolated. It doesn't matter that once a week you go see the best therapist on the planet. You're still going to struggle. And so that's kind of what we've been toying with. We have a big project now where we're working with within sport as a major vehicle for providing positive relational experiences, positive regulatory experiences, and the potential for that being a healing experience. But anyway, I'm talking too much. Sorry.
No, you're not. You're right on point. And can I push you a little bit? Because you and I at lunch 20 years ago, we're talking about, I'm an old pediatrician, as is Dana. No, she's not old. I am. Promoting well-being, the whole promotion, prevention opportunity in front of us, healing a culture, but it starts so early, like we're talking about. That's what Nurture Connection is about. So from everything you've learned, when you think about how to develop this social movement of next generation, babies are born every day, Bruce, and their future gets established pretty quickly. How do we think about the opportunity? How do you think about our opportunity? Both how we, what's in front of us that you would perhaps guide us to think about, but then think about obstacles on just that edge of our nurture.
Yeah. Well, and we've had conversations about this, and I'm not going to say anything that you haven't already said before and you haven't keyed in on. And I think, Dana, you've said the same thing from what I've read about your work and appreciation of the social determinants of health is, as goes the parent, so goes the child. Yeah. And so if we don't take care of young parents, if we don't provide consistent, predictable environments for them where they feel safe and valued and they feel like they belong, it's going to be very hard for them to then transfer that sense of safety to their young kids. And this is where social policy comes in. I mean, it's very hard when you're living as a marginalized person in poverty to create a bubble of safety and predictability and connection and belonging for your baby. Now, the amazing thing is, heroically, so many parents do that every day, but it taps them out. It burns you out. It consumes bandwidth. And pretty soon you're invisible. There's none of you left. And so the young parents have this choice, like, do I pour all of myself, all of what little minimal reserve I have into my babies and have nothing? And I think that a lot of parents end up doing that. And then they get worn out and they get exhausted and they get depressed and then that leads to this secondary, tertiary cascade. But this is why I think community is so important. That human beings were not intended to raise infants or children individually. We were meant for allo-parenting. We were meant to distribute the caregiving burdens across all kinds of people in our living environment. And That's why we need to have high quality childcare. We need to have high quality pre-K models. We have to have high quality places for young mothers with babies to go spend time with other mothers and their babies. And so the more we isolate people, the more we are making them vulnerable. The more we create environments for people to come together, the more we are increasing the probability that they can be their best as a parent. And all of this, it's hard to go out into a park and meet another young mother and have a conversation if there's no benches, if there's no playground, if there's no green space. Like, where are you going to go sit? On the curb of the corner? I mean, we're not thinking about this in our urban. Well, we are. Some people are now in urban planning, but that's where I think we have a lot of interesting opportunities to invent new things or recapture, as you said at the outset, recapture community. Anyway, I'm rambling.
I have a comment, a reflection, and then a question. And so my comment is, my research team and I recently published an article about the biologic manifestations of adversity early in life. And what we found is that we looked at levels of allostatic load, biologic wear and tear, and found that the children that had the highest levels of allostatic load were children who had parents who had mental health concerns, whether it's depression or anxiety or substance issues or otherwise. And so that goes right along with everything that you were just talking about having to really sort of protect, nurture, and create safety within relationships.
So first of all, I'm glad you're doing that kind of work, right?
Yeah.
That, I mean, more and more people need to be aware of these ideas. And the irony is, you probably have had the experience of going and talking about that, and there'll be a bunch of grandmothers in the room, and they'll come up and go, "I could have told you that." And you're like, "I know, I'm sorry that I had to actually do research to prove what we know is probably right?" But we live in a world where you have to have that kind of evidence to get policymakers to pay attention to this.
I agree. And so in one of the mini books that you wrote about the boy who was raised as a dog, this quote that you have from that book that I love is that the truth is you can't love yourself unless you've been loved and are loved. The capacity to love cannot be built in isolation. So how do we, as early childhood serving providers, help to build the capacity to love and that relational milieu?
Well, again, I think that if a young parent doesn't feel like they belong in the community, doesn't feel like the culture values them, whatever kind of person they are, then it's hard for them. In other words, if they're not loved, if they're not given a sense of belonging by our society and by that people in our community, then it's hard for them to turn around and give as much. And again, I think a lot of parents do it, even though they are marginalized, even though they are minimized, even though they are beaten down. And that's why I feel so many of these parents that we work with, I feel like they're heroic. They're the unsung heroes of our society because every little ounce of goodness they give away. And it eats them up. I mean, you've seen them. Somebody who's 35 years old will sometimes look like they're 50. Yeah. And you see they're just worn down.
That's allostatic load right there. The wear and the tear. And so there are many of us that belong to these marginalized communities, right? Where, especially as a Black person, we are told that society doesn't love us, right? Like our Black boys or Black men are not loved and are not valued. And so, one of the comments that you just made is that you have to feel like you are valued by a society, and maybe it's a niche within that society, because I think that oftentimes that feeling of love and value is not there on a societal level, but it can be within a community level.
Absolutely. Or a subgroup level. And I think, Dana, this is something I just got finished talking about systemic change with a bunch of physicians in Indiana. And one of the things that we were talking about was that the original model for healthy leadership is what we call distributed leadership, where the person who has the best skill at a certain activity in any given moment, they're the leader when we're doing that activity. And then they relinquish power and give power to somebody who's good at what the next task that the group is supposed to work on. And so what happens is, if you have this big sort of bureaucratic multi-layer system, the role of a good leader in that system is to create a bubble of protection for the people that you supervise, where you absorb a lot of the crap from the top. And that's what you're talking about, right? That you, either your community of faith or your gang or your neighborhood or whatever group it is that you can pull together to create your micro community, that's where you build this bubble of belonging and safety. And I think that that's a really powerful and important thing. And then the good news is that the neurobiology of human beings is such that we gravitate towards these biological pulls, right? So if there's just a little bit of an opportunity that, like, oh, wow, I fit here, and that's powerful. And so I think what we need to do is think about how we can support the creation of these micro bubbles, right? Oh. These relational bubbles of health in communities that are fragmented and overwhelmed. And it might be something that's why I love sports so much, because we are working with groups that are doing that. They're creating the Harlem Lacrosse, right? Who would think that, like, lacrosse is a rich white boys game? Who would think that Harlem is you go into Harlem, you provide the ability to learn this sport, you get some resources to create this bubble of connectivity, and these kids do better in school, they do better in their physical health outcomes and so forth. And I think that's what we have to do, is we have to look at where can we create these opportunities.
It's phenomenal. And as we're on our journey with Nurture Connection, and again, we're thinking the early foundations, and yet, relational connections are critical all along the developmental life course forever. We know that. Yeah. But we're trying to call out that, as you would say, those foundational elements really matter. And we're eager to make visible bright spots where it's actually happening. Tangible human stories and experiences that are showing that. Are you seeing any in the nation that gets you excited that you can think about? Or over time that you could point our way so we can make visible, because movement making requires narrative story. It requires, making idea into a reality that touches hearts. And we're really eager to make that visible. But any jump out to you as you think about it?
Well, one actually, right in California, it is a capacity building project. It's Christy Brandt's early childhood infant parent mental health certificate program, where people from all over the world, but heavily from California, these are professionals of all walks of life who are going through a very intensive learning experience to learn about the importance of early childhood. Nice. and then go back into their communities and begin to support these programs. So that's, and in context of being on the faculty there and at Edtronic's sort of parallel program up at UMass, I've been able to hear all kinds of innovative things that are taking place in the development of little micro programs where there's 8 or 10 parents, right? Or 8 or 10 families that are getting these specialized services and help. But here's the dilemma. I think one of the things, there's this tremendous fragmenting centripetal force that is taking place that in most households, if there are 2 parents, they've got to work. And if there aren't 2 parents,
they really have to work.
The parent has to work. And so we have a shit childcare system in this country. And so I think I think, I'm sure there's somewhere programs where there's high quality childcare that is facilitating the relational health and development of young kids. But I think because we have the most regressive child leave and maternal and parent leave policy of all the Western countries, we're just missing out on this incredible opportunity. And I just feel like I said this before. If somebody came from outer space, if one of these things that we're shooting down turns out to be an alien, and they were studying our behavior, they'd be going, "What in the hell? Look at their biology, and they don't all, and look at their programs. There's a huge mismatch between where they're putting all their attention and all their money, and when they can have even just a light touch presence, right? That's the beauty. A light touch of support for young parents with young kids would have a huge impact on our society, and we just can't seem to get people to do that. We just have a hard time, and that's why I'm so excited about what you guys are doing. That ultimately, the more people that understand these things, the more likely you are to sort of either intentionally or kind of serendipitously get a policymaker that can make a difference.
It's deeply on our mind, Bruce. I have another question, and then we've got about 10 more minutes. But one is, I think you and I have chatted in the past. I'm curious where your thought is about multi-age group early childhood experiences.
Yeah.
How you think, because we've stratified age groups, and which I think are competitive niches, quite frankly. I worry about it deeply. Nobody has 5 4-year-olds or 5 toddlers at the same time, right? Because
exactly.
What are you seeing? Where's your thinking going in that space?
Well, I do a lot of thinking about that issue, sort of the power of developmental heterogeneity for older kids in education, because we've seen how healthy it is if you've got 7th grade, 5th grade, 3rd graders, 1st graders who have an opportunity to at least co-learn some things, and then the older kids teach. So I think there's a tremendous value in sort of capturing the power of a developmentally heterogeneous environment. And I think that that's probably the same case. I think that's the same case with younger kids as well. That's how we learn, right? I mean, we learn by sort of observing and then emulate modeling and then teaching, right? And so that doesn't happen easily if there's just this stratified presence of kids that are kind of at the same developmental level as you. You kind of come up against a ceiling really quickly, and you depend upon, that means that the one person who's developmentally mature is somehow supposed to be providing all of the right modeling stuff at the right time for the right system for the right kid. And that just is impossible to do. Yeah. But if you have a mix of people and kids at sort of different developmental stages, then there's this, it's much easier to get a variety of things that the child will gravitate towards. They'll go, "Oh, I've already mastered blocks, but I don't know how to do this whole thing with crayons. That's a cool thing. Do that on the wall? No, I guess not. No, a wall. They got in a lot of trouble for doing that on the wall. Maybe you'll do it on the paper." and so that's how you learn, right? I mean, I talk to all kinds of kids that have grown up and are like 2nd and 3rd kids. And they talk about the experience of seeing they were able to sneak out of the house and never get in trouble because the oldest kid, they watched that didn't work and they figure out, all right, I'm going to do it this way.
Yeah, imitative learning and watching and learning is really powerful as a driver of human development, especially toddlers, 18-month-old, 1-year-olds, 9-month-olds. The imitative force is big.
Powerful.
And so very so. Thanks for leaning in there too. A couple final things. One, what's on the horizon for you? I mean, what's next? Got you going? And then
I'm actually working on. I'm trying to think. Actually, that's a really hard thing to do. And I'm. That's, I said it kind of lightheartedly, but it's true. We overschedule ourselves. We're screened up. And I don't think that most of us have the reflective time that we want. And I'm trying to build in a lot more reflective time into my week so that I can actually focus on some of these issues about systems. Because I really think that, I feel pretty good about the reductionist part of what I understand. I mean, I know a lot about the brain and there's a lot more to learn, but I really need to learn more and think more about how when I change the lens from a reductionist perspective and zoom out, what's going on in families and what's going on in neighborhoods and what's going on in society, and really what's the relationship between historical perspectives on an idea and how that has resulted in a set of solutions that get carried forward generation after generation after generation, but no longer work.
Right.
And we're living with that, right? We are living with these historical residues of problem-solving process from multiple generations previous. And we're, and many times those solutions were pretty destructive, pretty permeated with marginalizing, dehumanizing beliefs and practices. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are seeing very explicitly now and thinking about it. So that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to see whether or not the things we know about the biology of development and the brain can be helpful in thinking about more efficient systemic change. Because I think right now the way we try to change systems is tinkering. We tinker too much. We tinker and we pick around the edges, and we think that we're going to make an organization trauma informed by having a few classes, and then we're going to make a system sort of be non-racist because we have an anti-racist officer, and we do all of this sort of it's sort of like decoration. We sort of do policy decorations without changing the fundamental structure of the building. And I think we have to, in some cases, either move out of the building into a new structure, or we have to blow up the structure we're in, which is probably not very productive either.
Our nurture connection, collective impact steering committee thinking is constantly at that front space of thinking about what do we deconstruct, what do we blow up, what do we add on, and the balance of that, all keeping our eyes on the relational context and the community context and the cultural and historical context, because it's complicated, but that's what's in front of us right now. Dana, do you want to help finish us up? We have about 3 or 4 more minutes. Anything jump out?
Yeah, I'm wondering, as we conclude, an acknowledgement that many of us have very heavy hearts right now about what's happening in the world and in our communities. So as a child psychiatrist, what advice do you have for those of us that are in families and raising children about how to heal?
Yeah. Well, the good news is that if you look at the historical trajectory of the good qualities of humankind, they're being enriched. There is more humanity. There is more creativity. There is more productivity. There's compassion lives. Now it's fragile, and if we don't take good care of these things, it will go. But I'm optimistic about the ability for well-intended folks who have the right tools to help make the world a little bit better for their kids, and their kids, if we give them the right tools, they'll make it better for our grandkids, and on and on. So I am optimistic. The piece of advice I have is this, is that you kind of have to live in two worlds. You have to live in the moment, because if you don't live in the moment, and if you're not fully present in that moment, everything in the future just disappears. So do your very best to be present and loving and attentive and listen with your little ones. Be patient with yourself and recognize that there's a power in the relationship that is beyond our ability to explain. And those little moments don't have to be long, but if you have a lot of these little moments, you'll regulate and you'll reward your children. They'll grow up, they'll watch you, they'll listen to you, they'll follow your guidance. They'll have appropriate rebellions. They'll do all the right stuff, and they'll make the world better. And trust in the relational process, right? Trust if we give ourselves in the moment in a full way, there will be all kinds of positive things that can happen. And so that's one foot. The other foot is find time to be reflective and look into your past, the past of your people, the past of your life, and then think about the future. So, because we can be intentional, we can make things better, but we can't if we don't use the smartest part of our cortex. I mean, that's our gift. We really, our capacity to reflect is a really powerful thing. And both of those things, one foot in the present and one foot in in this reflective mode, both of those require that you take care of yourself and that you're regulated and that you're able to be present and that you're able to reflect when you can. So you have to be kind to yourself. Give yourself time, space, good food, good friends, good music,
And good conversation.
And good conversation. Exactly.
Like we've just had today, Bruce, we're increasing ourselves talking about the space in between. As we share the space in between has power.
Yeah,
and critical
exactly.
opportunities. And it's been an incredible joy again, Bruce, to be together. We welcome you anytime you want to have a conversation with us. Any of our little tables of conversation of imagining, reflecting to this movement making, you're always invited. And so you may hear from me from time to time, but what a joy to be together today. Thank you.
So it's always fun to talk with you, David and Dana. I've long admired your work. I appreciate all the work that you guys are doing in California. It's hard work, but it's really important. So keep it up. Thank you.
Thank you. I loved being in the moment with both of you.
Awesome.
Okay, Annika, we appreciate your hosting us together. Thank you.